Okay, so now I want to talk about a topic that I feel very strongly about. And I feel very strongly about this because I think most podcasters do this wrong. And this is the naming of your podcast and creating the tagline for your show. The reason why I believe most podcasters do this wrong is because one of the main things that essentially podcasters need, regardless of whether their end objective is to build network or their end objective is to earn money, is that a podcaster needs to actually get a large number of streams or downloads or listens. I mean, pick whichever nomenclature you find best. But in the naming of their podcast, they don't take this into consideration. Most podcasters tend to launch their show once they've taken out an episode and they've gone through all of that effort. After this point is when they start thinking about getting wider reach for their particular podcast and making sure that their episode gets heard by as many people as possible. And that's a travesty because they've unfortunately done a large number of things that can't be undone. And this is where the problem begins. This is the root cause. It starts with the name, and then at every single step, you need to optimize for discovery. And that's something that I feel very strongly about. So, when it comes to the naming of your podcast, I think there are three major tenets that you need to keep in mind. The first thing is that you need to take into consideration that a podcast is not like a movie and it's not like a TV show. You rarely have trailers for podcasts. And even if trailers exist for podcasts, they still aren't commonplace enough that a large number of people are listening to them. And then the second thing that you need to take into consideration is essentially that there aren't many well-known names in podcasting yet, like a Christopher Nolan or like an Amy Schumer, etc. Amy Schumer has her own podcast. I'm cognizant of this, but there aren't such well-known names in the podcasting space where people know exactly what they should be consuming, like on Netflix or on Amazon Prime, because you know that this is your favorite actor. Leonardo DiCaprio's in this, so to listen or watch this particular thing. When it comes to podcasting, you need to, firstly, with your name, you need to be obvious. You need to understand that you have about 3 words, and in those 3 words, you need to be able to tell somebody exactly what your podcast is going to be about. One of the worst case scenarios is that somebody sees your podcast and they see your cover art and they click on that podcast believing that they're going to get a specific experience, and then they start to listen to your show. And because you weren't obvious enough with your name, they end up getting a completely different experience than they bargained for, and they drop off. That's very, very painful for any podcaster because you've gone through so much effort and you almost got that listener, but then that listener dropped off. So be as obvious as you can. So in our example, where we're talking about the startup podcast that we were discussing, you can call it Startup DIY, or you can call it Startup Secrets, or you need to call it something basically as obvious as that, so that when somebody is looking at your name, there is no ambiguity on what that particular show is about. They cannot be confused by what your show is going to be about. So that's the first thing when it comes to coming up with your podcast name. Don't try to be sexy with this. Try to be obvious with this and concise with this. The second thing that I see most podcasters missing in terms of a step that they really should follow is take the name that you have. And let's say that you've come up with 4 or 5 specific names and go to any SEO tool that exists online, whether that's Moz or anything else, Neil Patel, whatever, and plug that name into that SEO engine. Why? It's because this is the point in which you need to actually know and find out how competitive is that name going to be in the days to come? Are you playing against a Goliath that uh, you'll never be able to rank against in search engines across the world? And if that is the case, then stay away from that name. Stay very far away from that name. You need to plug it into a search engine tool that will basically be able to tell you at a keyword capacity that this name that you come up with um, is an optimum name. There is not much competitiveness within it. And it's something that, given a lot of hard work on your side and a little bit of luck, you can actually be the dominant name across search engines in the days to come when that name is, or that particular set of keywords is typed into a search engine. That's something that I truly believe podcasters should do, but no podcaster does this. And then going forward, even if they've created the best show on earth, they are never able to rank on search engines because they're competing against folks that have had those names as either website domains or have had those names as blogs, and they've had them for the last 10 to 12 years. That's what she said, or similar names to that. And then the third thing is check the competitive nature of your name within the podcasting universe. So the last point that I mentioned was seeing the competitive nature of the name in the world of the internet. Now, the final point is check the competitive nature of the name that you've come up with in the world of podcasts. So go into any podcast platform, whether this is Spotify, whether this is Castbox, Google Podcasts, Hubhopper, whatever platform you wish to go to, and just plug in that name. If you are finding more than 5 or 6 different podcasts that have the same name, it's not an ideal situation. If those 5 or 6 names have very little traction and they have not been picked up yet, you can still go ahead with them. If, however, those particular podcasts have 1 or 2 outliers within them that have already created a huge name for themselves, you need to stay away from that name. You need to stay away from that name like the plague. And this is one of the first major fundamental building blocks of making sure that your podcast is going to be discoverable and will stand out from the back in comparison to other people in the naming of your show. So don't make the mistakes that so many podcasters make, where they choose a name that rolls off the tongue, that sounds cute, that has a tongue-in-cheek twist to it, or they don't check any SEO tool, or they don't check the podcasting world in terms of how many other podcasts exist within the podcasting universe that have the exact same phrasing. So if you take these things into consideration, you're going to really benefit from this going forward. Mark my words, I promise you. And now when it comes to the tagline, that is extremely simple. The tagline should just be an elaborate phrasing of the quid pro quo that we discussed in the last video. So the transaction that you have created or elaborated in your mind, you should be able to state it in a sentence beautifully right here itself. So, for example, this should be the podcast that we're creating should be called the tagline can be something like a snackable show that gives young entrepreneurs tips and tricks for creating no-code startups in a bootstrap fashion, something along those lines, so that when somebody is reading it, they know exactly what they're going to be getting out of this equation, and they know whether this podcast is meant for them. And if you have these two things down, you're already doing so much better than most. So I really hope that you follow a couple of these tips and tricks, and I'll see you in the next one.